Hey everybody, and welcome to Dominion Cards, the video series, a WOODCUTTER strategic, in-depth look at various cards in the board game Dominion. So something a little bit different today. Now that the second edition of Seaside and Prosperity have come out, I happen to have videos made for cards that are no longer in print. So originally when I covered Base and Intrigue, I decided to skip over the cards that weren't in print anymore. You know, you couldn't buy them, you couldn't play them on the website, dominion.games either. Since then, you know, the app has come out, which actually does have these old cards implemented, and you can buy them separately if you want to. And given I happen to have videos on removed cards, I thought, you know what, maybe it'll be fun to just go over these. Maybe people want to know if these cards are worth buying or whatever, or they still have these, and they were just curious on my thoughts. I admit a little bit of it is partially like stalling for time as well, just to get a bit more familiar with the new second edition cards before I do the videos on them. So I was going to cover all these cards in one video, and then I'll do another video with the 6 removed Intrigue ones as well. I'm doing them all in one video because I can't do random kingdom analysis on these because, you know, I use the website for that when they're not available, and also I'm not going to buy these cards in the app, right, and like do it there. Because I don't really want to play with these cards, as you'll find out. So I thought I'd just bundle these all into one video, and we're going to do it fairly quickly as well. I don't want this to take forever, and, you know, how much value is there in going super in-depth with cards that people don't really play with anymore? So let's get to it. So first of all, we'll start with Woodcutter. This is the simplest of the cards. So it's a 3-cost action card, and it just gives you +1 buy and +2 coins. So very, very simple, very, very vanilla. So Woodcutter is basically just what we call a terminal silver. You know, it costs an action, it gives you 2 coins. It also gives you a buy on top. It even costs the same as silver, costing 3, so like direct competition with silver. So it's sort of a silver, but you trade one of your actions for an extra buy. And the problem is that actions are usually much better resource than plus buy. You know, you want more actions usually than you want more buys. This card is generally very weak. This is not a very good trade-off that you get for it. So the main benefit that you're really getting from Woodcutter is the fact that it's pretty cheap, right? Only costs 3, which is not bad. But bear in mind that there are cheaper sources of plus buy out there, so Woodcutter is not even like doing particularly well necessarily in this regard. And a lot of them you can get the plus buy non-terminally as well. So like Pawn, Ducat, Bauble, and like Candlestick Maker, these are all examples that come to mind. Some of them better than the others. And, you know, none of them are giving you like 2 coins when you play it, but, you know, these are all much cheaper and don't really have the problem of being terminal like Woodcutter does. At least with Pawn, you can optionally make it non-terminal, I guess. Now, in addition to that, there are some cards that are like Woodcutter, but with extra benefits, like what I'd call a Woodcutter Plus, that are out there, and they all cost 4 because they're just an improvement over Woodcutter. So an example might be Messenger from Adventures. And, you know, it has this extra on gain effect and also this Chancellor effect, a card we're going to cover a little bit later. So it just got a load more stuff piled onto it. Now, there is a difference between cards costing 3 and 4, but there's not always that much of a difference. Like, the big jump is from 4 to 5. So the fact that there exist better versions of Woodcutter that are a little bit more expensive is not normally that relevant for Woodcutter. You know, it doesn't really save Woodcutter in that regard. Now, being cheap does mean that Woodcutter is easier to pick up, like, opportunistically, so that it's around later on when the plus buy is more useful and your deck is, you know, outperforming a little bit better. So that's always a nice thing about cheap plus buy. But despite talking about how cheap Woodcutter is, do not be fooled by the fact that it is cheap, you see. There's something that I call the terminal tax, and this is just a fact that terminal action cards are usually a little bit more expensive than they might first seem. So the problem is that in order to use Woodcutter, usually there are other action cards you want to play as well. That means that you're most likely going to need some village support in order to play Woodcutter. And villages usually don't come along for free. That's going to cost you buys and money, or some of your like workshop gains that could have been spent on other things. So to do a direct comparison directly in the base game, Festival is a little bit like having 2 villages and a Woodcutter all at once. But the problem is that it costs 5 and 1 buy, and 2 villages and a Woodcutter costs 9 and 3 buys. So just to give you some idea of how much better a card like Festival's going to be than Woodcutter. And you might be saying, well, it's not really fair. I mean, Woodcutter's a lot cheaper. And yeah, it is. Like, you expect cards to be worse when they're cheaper, right? Like, not every card has to be, like, vaguely balanced. Like, that's not the way Dominion works. You can have some cards that are not very good and some cards that are a lot better, but Woodcutter, it sort of highlights that Woodcutter's really actually not very good at all and giving you much. And this sort of is the main problem with Woodcutter, in that it just sort of doesn't really do very much for you at all, barely anything, but costs you an action to do so. It's not the worst source of plus buy out there, but it is one of the worst, right? It gets close to the bottom, kind of a source of plus buy of last resort. The reason why you buy Woodcutter is because you need a plus buy, basically, and sometimes you'll do anything for plus buy, and that means Woodcutter. But if there's other plus buy out there on the board, the reality is that almost any other source is highly likely to be better. Not all of them, you still get stuff like Herbalist, which is terrible, but Woodcutter's not really punching above its weight enough to actually be competitive with other cards. One last point, very early on in Dominion, people saying like, Woodcutter Gardens Rush. I just wanted to highlight, just in case you were thinking that was a good use for it. No, it's not. It's very bad. This is much, much worse than like using Workshop to gain gardens. There's not really much else to discuss about Woodcutter because it's very, very vanilla. We all know how buys and coins work, right? Unsurprisingly, vanilla cards, there's just less to say because they're just not really doing anything interesting or exotic. So let's move on. So next up we have Chancellor. This is another 3-cost action card. It gives you 2 coins, and then it says you may immediately put your deck into your discard pile. So we just need to clarify that statement at first. So putting your deck into your discard pile is not the same thing as discarding every card that's in your deck. It is a simple moving of cards from the deck to the discard pile. No discard effects are triggered, so that means that reactions like Tunnel and Village Green that really care about being discarded and want you to discard them, they do not get activated by Chancellor, okay? So Chancellor is yet another terminal silver that costs 3. Now, instead of this one giving you a plus buy, it's got this optional effect to immediately cycle the entirety of your remaining deck. If you don't use the optional effect, then Chancellor is basically just a terminal silver, which is really not very good at all. This is a terrible card if it's just terminal silver. So, given it's got this extra effect that's optional and you may not choose to get it a lot, well, we better hope that optional effect is pretty good, because, to make up for the fact that this card's really not got a lot going for it. And just some spoilers, it's not good, unfortunately. Chancellor's a very bad card. So before we talk about the optional effect, we need to just cover the concept of cycling. So cycling is something that's generally considered good. So the overall theory here is that when you gain a card, you only get to play it once every shuffle, and the faster you reach your next shuffle, the sooner you get to play all of your cards again. Now, it's a lot better usually to play cards more often. If I'm buying a card and adding it to my deck, the more times I played it, effectively the more value I got out of it, right? So the value of gaining a card and playing it sort of goes up and up and up the more times I actually got to use that card's effects. So Chancellor immediately cycles you to the end of your shuffle. So the next time you draw a card, you're going to shuffle, and all of those cards that are in your deck going to come into play again. So this could be quite a lot of cycling, right? If you still had like 30 cards in your deck, Chancellor will cycle past all of them. That's gigantic amounts of cycling, to be fair, right? Chancellor is like a super duper cycling card. If all you want to do is just cycle to the end of your shuffle, Chancellor's, that's going to be what it does for you. So that might sound pretty good. Well, what's the problem then? So the main problem with Chancellor cycling is that it's indiscriminate. So the thing with a lot of other cards that we consider like cycling or sifting or filtering or whatever, like Cellar or Warehouse, is that, they add the cycling past these cards, but they specifically target the bad cards to push past. The problem is that the whole point of cycling is that you get to play your best cards more often. And that means that you don't want to cycle past the good cards. You want to only cycle past certain cards, because if your deck has all your best cards in it and you use Chancellor and push past them, then you're not actually playing these good cards. And in that case, what was the point in doing the cycling, really? Now, yes, and you buy cards this turn or gain more of them, they go straight to the discard, and by cycling you hopefully get to play the cards that you just bought a little bit earlier. But, if you're then just cycling past those cards and not playing them, well, buying those cards isn't doing anything for you anymore. And there's a second problem as well, which is that Chancellor is very, very random and highly dependent on draw order. The amount of cycling that you get changes quite drastically based on where in your shuffle you drew Chancellor. So if you draw it too late, you just basically don't have a deck anymore, and then you're not actually doing any cycling. And if you draw it too early, then the quality of the cards in your deck are going to be better than like the cards in your discard, right? So you don't actually want to cycle because you'll cycle past them all. That's sort of a general rule for should I use an effect like Chancellor's, by the way. What's the quality of the cards that you've already got in play or in your discard pile? And what's the quality of the cards in your draw pile? If the cards in your draw pile are going to be better, then there's no point using the cycling because you just won't get a chance to play them anymore. So that means that Chancellor's effect actually is fairly common that you don't want to use it. There are all sorts of scenarios that can show up where using Chancellor's cycling effect is actually pretty bad. The problem is that just relegates Chancellor to being a terminal silver a lot of the time, right? Like, it's got this extra bonus, but you're just not using it. And unfortunately, just plain old terminal silver is just not really good enough for a terminal action, right? Like, you can do a lot better with your action. Chancellor is not just directly competing with silver, it is directly competing with every terminal action card in the kingdom, and it's just too weak, basically. Like, this effect is just not good a lot of the time. You just aren't using Chancellor for its bonus when you get it a lot of the time. Now, it's not completely useless. We're going to just go through a couple of example interactions. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's just some ideas of things where you might be able to get extra value out of Chancellor's effect. These, of course, all apply to cards that also give this effect, but are better, like Messenger, for example, rather than just Chancellor. And, well, we'll go over it again when we cover those cards. But let's just rattle through some examples quickly. So, Mountain Village, if you've put your entire deck in your discard pile, it gets to just basically grab exactly the card you want. You can effectively draw exactly the card that you need. Now, the problem with this is that Chancellor is terminal, so that means you've got to spend one of your villages on playing the Chancellor early, which gives less room in your hand for basically like having more mountain villages and doing more stuff. So it's got some problems. It's also worth noting that I call out Mountain Village specifically because other cards that hunt through your discard pile, like Harbinger, actually don't work with Chancellor because they draw a card first. Right, you play Chancellor and then you play a Harbinger. Harbinger immediately triggers the shuffle, and then by the time it comes to look in your discard, you haven't got a discard pile anymore. So Mountain Village is sort of a special case in that regard. Another example, Secret Passage. Secret Passage lets you take a card from your hand and just put it anywhere in your deck. So what it gets to do a lot is bottom deck really bad cards like Estates. And that's nice because then as you start to get closer and closer to the end of your shuffle, you just play Chancellor and wham, you just skip over all of those cards that you bottom decked and you never have to draw them again, basically. Secret Passage, I covered that in its video, but it's sort of like retroactively deciding that actually you wanted to draw a certain card in a different order. And just like, oh, I drew this estate early? Nah, actually it was at the bottom of my deck the entire time, right? Which isn't that useful on its own, but something like Chancellor can make that a little bit better. A last example, Emissary from Allies. This has a benefit if you trigger a shuffle while drawing with it. So if you flip your deck into your discard and then play Emissary, you will get a chance to get the favour tokens and the extra action. Of course, the problem is Chancellor is terminal, it means you've got to play it before you play the Emissary. That's sometimes a problem. It's not just Emissary, there are other things that trigger on shuffle, like, Star Chart, for example, but and how good is this? I'm not saying that this is actually good, but it is an interaction, and maybe one day something like this will actually be useful for you. But overall, Chancellor's pretty bad, actually. You're sort of not really using it. You're just never buying it, and that's fine. It's just a dud. So next up is Feast. This is a 4-cost action. It says trash this card, gain a card costing up to 5 coins. So Feast is what we call a non-conditional one-shot. So it trashes itself when you play it. This is what we call a one-shot, right? You only use it one time and then whoop, it's gone from your deck. However, the benefit that it gives when you play it is not conditional on it being trashed. So it tells you to trash the card, but sometimes you can't, right? And that means that if you've managed to find a way to get around trashing this card, you're still going to get the benefit from it anyway and gain a card costing up to 5. So there are ways to do this, like command cards, like multiple plays, like Throne Room, and you still get to gain the card. So that's really important to note for Feast, by the way. So what is a one-shot? Well, most cards are going to provide you their effect every time you shuffle. You just get to keep playing the card over and over again. One-shots effectively only really provide you the benefit one time. Now, there are other things that provide you benefits once when you buy them, events that were introduced from adventures, but the difference between events and a one-shot is that the event gives you the effect right now. However, the one-shot doesn't do anything until you shuffle it, and then you draw it. And, in the case of Feast, you've also got to spend an action after you've finally drawn it. So as its effect is temporary, but it's also delayed after buying it, it needs to be a very good effect in order to actually be worth buying the one-shot. So the problem with Feast's effect is that it's just not really good enough to justify the fact that it's a one-shot. Now, gaining a card costing up to 5, on its own, you know what, that's actually a pretty good effect. There's a lot of 5-cost gainers out there like Artisan, and we look at them and we say, this is a great card, right? Gaining cards costing up to 5 is pretty good. But the thing with the gainer is that you're going to get multiple 5-cost cards, right? Feast gets you one time, right? And that on its own just isn't really very good for a one-shot, right? You'd be much better off investing in a more permanent way of gaining more 5-cost cards. An example of that is something like silver, right? Sometimes you open silver because you specifically want to be getting 5-cost cards early, and then over time, you get to buy more of them because you have a better economy. Now, it's worth noting in the case of opening silver, I would just say your chance of getting a 5 is actually a bit higher if you have Feast than if you open with silver because, if you play the Feast, you're guaranteed to get the 5. So that's worth noting, but, long term for your deck, how good is it that you bought something that then disappeared straight away? So we talked about 5-cost gainers like Artisan in general. It's worth noting that gainers, as a concept, they are sort of a way of getting other cards that makes it a little bit slower until you actually get to play the cards because you're adding this extra step in the middle, right? I'm not just say with Artisan, the problem is that by buying the Artisan, I could have instead just bought the 5-cost card that I wanted, right? Originally, I'm sort of adding this extra step in and this slowdown to getting the card. But there's sort of the trade-off there that you're just, over time, going to get more and more copies. So, you get the gainer early, and over time, eventually, you're way better off than you were as if you just bought the card that you wanted directly. Now, the problem, of course, with the single-shot gainer is that you don't get this upside long-term. In fact, you just get the downside and you don't get the upside at all. So Feast isn't adding more cards to your deck over time. In fact, it just replaces itself once. Right. Another thing with Workshop is that even in the absence of something like Plus Buy, over time you start to gain more than one card per turn into your deck. But Feast doesn't really do this because in that sort of scenario, you had to buy the Feast and then you replaced itself. You were still sort of only getting one card per turn overall, right? You just used the Feast as a way, as an intermediary thing. You don't really outperform on singleton boards with Feast than you would with something like Workshop, right? You're not improving the speed at which your deck gets better, essentially, over time. And as I mentioned early on, there exist some cards that allow you to work around the trashing and take advantage of the fact that the gaining is not conditional on trashing it. So Throne Rooms and the command cards are the primary examples of this. Throne Rooms let you play Feast a second time, and you can't trash it because it's already in the trash, but you still get to gain a second card. And command cards like Overlord, or at least more modern wordings of Overlord, these will play a card leaving it there. So Feast will just get played. It can't move to the trash when you play it from the supply, but you still get to gain the card anyway. And then stuff like Necromancer, once Feast is in the trash, you can just play it without effectively, the Feast, it's already in the trash, so you can't trash it at that point, but you still get to gain. But it's worth noting that it's still usually worse Feast than a more permanent gainer, because, you can still throne permanent gainers like Artisan, right? Like, Feast isn't really offering you any benefit in that regard. It's still, you're losing it, and it's a very temporary effect. The only real benefit that you get is that this doesn't cost 5, it costs less at 4, and technically at some point you get to take what was a gain of a card costing 4, and eventually it'll turn into a 5, but this is pretty slow. So Feast is a pretty bad card overall, unfortunately. Again, just super weak, it's not really adding much to many games that it shows up in. Silver's usually better than Feast, and that's a bad sign for Feast. So let's move on to Spy. This is a 4-cost action and attack. It says +1 card, +1 action. Each player, including you, reveals the top card of his deck and either discards it or puts it back. Your choice. So, when we just look about what Spy is doing for you, it is a cantrip with a very minor sifting effect that might not actually get any sifting out of it, but it might push you past 1 card. You draw a card, then you look at the next one. If it's bad, something like a State or Copper that you don't want, you can discard past it. Right? So this is usually worse than drawing it, but in some cases it's kind of equivalent. Like if you weren't drawing your deck anyway or hitting the shuffle, and and it was a card like a State that you simply weren't going to be playing, there's not really that much difference between drawing it and pushing past it, right? If you weren't going to remodel it either or anything like that. It is worse in the case of something like Copper that you could have played and actually got money out of. So, but, it's not always worse than drawing a card is what I'm trying to say. So something like Wishing Well draws you a card or draws a card and then may draw you a second. Spy, a little bit like that, right? Like, if you revealed an estate with Spy and you'd guessed estate with Wishing Well, then, kind of the same thing. Either way, that estate's not in the way anymore. Or something like Vagrant that will specifically, always pick up estates. Now, if the card that you reveal is good, then you do put it back. And Spy sort of effectively didn't really do anything that turn. It's what we call a do-nothing cantrip, where it basically just replaced itself in your deck with what would have been the next card along anyway, and it didn't really cost you an action to do that. However, occasionally knowing what the top card of your deck is helpful. There are some card synergies out there that do this, so like playing Vassal or Lookout safely, or, guessing Mystic correctly. I suppose in the case of Lookout, you would actually put the bad card back and then know that it's there to trash. But yeah, this is not unique to Spy. There are a bunch of other cards that do this, like if you fail to guess Wishing Well correctly, you've also peeked at the top card of your deck and you know what it is. Of course, we've been focusing on what Spy does just for you, but this is not all that the card does. It's also an attack, and it attacks your opponent as well. So, with your opponent, you get to similarly discard or put back the top card of each of your opponent's decks. Now, if you put the card back, each future Spy that you play this turn is going to reveal the same card again, which effectively disables the attack. Right? Once you found a bad card to leave on top of their deck with Spy, you're not really doing anything anymore with their deck. So usually what you're looking to do with Spy is discard their strongest cards until you find a weak one to leave on top, and this just makes their deck a little bit more unreliable because they draw a bad card early in their hand. Sometimes this is not the case. You may want to look for a particular card to leave on top so you can launch another attack that targets the top of their deck. So something like Bandit, or in the case of first edition, Thief, or a card like Swindler. And this is all exactly the same as like I've discussed in the Scrying Pool video, which also has this attack. So if you want to know a little bit more, there is that video as well. Now for you, and the effect it has on you, Spy tends to get better the more copies of it that you have, because you're more likely that some Spy is going to end up like discarding a bad card, because you just get more chances to do it. However, the attack portion gets worse because it's more likely that you're going to stop at some bad card and then the attack sort of shuts itself off. The biggest issue with Spy is the opportunity cost. It costs 4 and doesn't really do very much for you, unfortunately. So you really need a way that getting 4-cost cards is quite cheap. So it could be like Workshop and you've ran out of like the village pile that you really wanted, and then, I might as well get the spies, right? But just bear in mind, spy, it's not really doing that much as a card, and you're paying quite a lot for something that's just usually doing very little. But the main reason why it actually got removed from the game is because it was way too slow. You have to make a decision for every single opponent on a card that is basically what we call spammable, right? Like, you can just play Spy over and over and over and over, and it's not really hurting you that much, but you sure are making a lot of decisions every time you do that, and the game just grinds to a halt. Power-wise, it's a very weak card, but I wouldn't say it was too terrible. Like, at the end of the day, it's a do-nothing cantrip, right? Like, it's not hurting you in a lot of cases. If you want to know more about do-nothing cantrips, the Pearl Diver video, another removed card, goes into a lot of generic detail about like cantrips that aren't really doing anything for you. If you took the attack off of Spy, it would be perfectly fine. 2-cost card, it would look a little bit like Vagrant, I guess, in that regard. Still a little bit different, but so you are paying a lot for that attack, which isn't really that much of an attack. So that's Spy. And we're going to move on now to Thief. This is another 4-cost action and attack card. There's a lot of text on this one. It says, each other player reveals the top 2 cards of his deck. If they revealed any treasure cards, they trash one of them that you choose. You may gain any or all of these trash cards. They discard the other revealed cards. So it is worth noting that Thief got a direct replacement in the 2nd edition. Bandit, it just came in and just took over Thief, basically, following the same niche. So Thief is also a treasure trashing attack. It also gain you a treasure as well when you play it. So it shares some similarities with Bandit, but actually there are some major differences between Thief and Bandit, which there should be, because otherwise, why would it have been replaced? So, first of all, it costs less. It costs 4 instead of 5, which is meaningful difference. 4-cost cards are very different to 5-cost cards in terms of price. The Thief player chooses which treasure is trashed when presented with the choice. So, if it flips over a silver and a gold, you get to target gold, whereas with Bandit, the victim gets to make the choice, and they're probably going to target the silver instead. Thief trashes your opponent's coppers. This is a very big difference. It doesn't always give you a gold, so Bandit guarantees you that you get exactly 1 gold when you play it. Instead, what Thief does is you optionally get to steal any treasures that it trashes. If your opponent has to trash like a silver, you get to choose to take that silver then. This means that it can gain a treasure card per opponent, but it is optional and isn't necessarily going to. It can whiff entirely, or it can hit a copper and trash that, and you're like, actually, I don't really want the copper. So the big thing, first of all, Thief targets coppers. A lot of the times it may be forced to trash coppers from your opponent. If you reveal coppers and no other treasure, for example, you gotta trash a copper. You don't get to choose not to trash anything. Problem is that copper's a really bad card, and oftentimes your opponent is more than happy to have their coppers disappear. They want you to trash their coppers a lot of the time. So this means that early in the game, playing Thief will actually help your opponent. This is the opposite of what you want for an attack. It's cycling them a little bit, and it's getting rid of their coppers as well. That's brilliant news for your opponent. So being bad early means that the fact that Thief costs less is actually a lot less relevant. Usually you do not want to open Thief, even though it costs 4. Right, you could, but you don't want to, because you're just going to help out your opponent. And another problem that Thief has is that as player counts increase, Thief can get a little bit crazy. Right, in a 4-player game, you could get 3 golds from a single play of Thief. Yeah, it depends a lot on what you actually hit, but you can get exceptionally good outcomes. Right, gaining 3 golds is treasure map, but you don't actually have to match it with another treasure map, which is a lot better as a card, right? And it trashed these golds from your opponent as well, holy moly, that's pretty good. So outcomes vary very wildly with Thief. It could be actively helpful to your opponent, trashing their coppers. It could give you just a load of very good treasure cards as well. It's incredibly swingy, this card. The difference of what you get when you play it is just massive a bunch of the time. Now, Thief doesn't just trash special treasures, something that Bandit also does. It lets you gain them as well, and it's worth noting that sometimes this can be very, very strong. So, for example, Thief can trash platinums. and then lets you gain the platinums, right? So it'd be a platinum gainer, which, wow, very strong. It can gain you heirlooms, so, knocking out your opponent's magic lamp with something like Bandit can be pretty strong, because that's a pretty good card. But if you gain it as well with Thief, then that's excellent. I'll happily take a second magic lamp. Yes, please. So Thief can be just like wild sometimes, very, very powerful in the right circumstances, and if you get lucky. And this is sort of another problem, and it's the same sort of one that Bandit has when we talk about its attack, not necessarily being that impactful. The search space is pretty small, right? It only searches the top 2 cards of their deck, and in a lot of decks you don't actually want that high a density of treasure cards. That means that even when all the coppers are gone, the Thief actually has a reasonable chance of just missing, and you don't get anything from it. Same as Bandit, really. Now, it's more impactful the more of them are played, because it's more likely to find something. So that means in higher player counts, it is possible for Thief to actually do quite a lot of damage, just because you've got like 3 opponents that are all playing it against you, and then it's going to hit 3 times as often, and you actually are not going to be able to keep any of your treasures around. But this one, it's more relevant with who trashes the treasures as opposed to Bandit, where it doesn't really matter who knocks your treasures out. So it's a lot swingier, right? Someone's going to get that treasure off you and have a great Thief while everyone else is going to whiff. Trashing coppers leads to another problem that Thief has, is that at higher player counts, because you can open Thief, it's entirely possible, especially with new players that don't really know what they're doing, but Thief sounds pretty good. Everyone buys Thief because they can open with it, and then someone just gets all of their coppers trashed. We say that trashing coppers is good, but the problem is that sometimes you don't really have any alternative early game. Maybe there are no other kingdom cards that generate money, and so you kind of have to have treasures. And you can very quickly suddenly lose all your money, and then you can't get any thieves of your own. And I've actually seen this happen in real life. Some players were new, they all went in on Thief except for one guy who didn't, and then he just lost a bunch of coppers, and before he realised it, he couldn't do anything anymore, right? His deck was like 2 coppers and 3 estates, and it's just like, I can't buy anything except coppers, which then, of course, just kept getting walloped. And he actually got stuck all game. He couldn't do anything except buy coppers. It was very sad. What a miserable game that poor guy had. I was very glad to see Thief go, because I didn't get experiences like this anymore. So what this means is that Thief, actually, when you hear some group saying, oh my god, Thief, it's so powerful, and you're like, what? I thought Thief was terrible. It can be centralizing on certain boards, especially with high player counts, as they just endlessly trade treasures with each other, not really go anywhere, but you kind of have to do it, right? Because if you stop playing Thief, you just lose all your money, and otherwise you're just sitting there playing Thief, and just everyone's just passing these treasures around between themselves. So, Thief was too weak in 2-player games. Trashing coppers made it completely awful, and you would help your opponent, and you wouldn't get you anything at all, even if it missed. Right? Even with Bandit, you can whiff the attack, it's still going to give you a gold. On a Thief, you're just going to get nothing. It's very inconsistent on the outcomes that it gives you on play, and you will get, sometimes it'll gain you gold, sometimes it'll get you nothing. And it scales very, very badly with the number of players. It's even more inconsistent the more players that you add, right? Someone's getting 3 golds and someone's getting nothing, right? Very bad. So just terribly designed card was Thief. And Bandit's a lot better. Fills the niche without all of the problems. So very, very good upgrade, I think. Thief is bad. And let's move on to the last one, Adventurer. So this is a 6-cost action card, very expensive. It says reveal cards from your deck until you reveal 2 treasure cards. Put those treasure cards into your hand and discard the other revealed cards. So let's get straight to the point here. Adventurer is massively overpriced. It was widely regarded at the time as the most overpriced card in the game. You couldn't look at Adventurer and say, this is worth 6. Just no way at all. At the time, it was very, very close to the bottom of the list in power rankings of all cards. If you said Adventurer is the worst card in the game, honestly, you had a lot of ways to argue in favour of that. I'm not sure it was actually the worst, but it was definitely the worst in the base game for sure. Exceptionally weak card, was wrong to buy it almost always. So one of the big problems is Adventure requires you to get rid of your coppers before you buy one, or at least start using it at least. You really don't want Adventurer to be drawing coppers. This seriously impacts how good it is. You want it to be finding much, much better cards like silver and gold. So for example, if you found a copper and a silver with your Adventurer, then this was like a terminal gold, right? It earned you 3 coins. It did a bit of cycling, but ultimately you got 3 money for that play. It cost the same as gold though, right? Like it was just, you could have bought a gold and saved yourself the action, basically, right? For what was effectively like the same outcome on this turn. Here's the problem though, if you have removed all of your coppers, then it's highly likely that you're looking to play some sort of like thin engine deck, right? A thin deck's most suited for engines, they sort of really like them, it lets you match together like the villages and so on with other things. And if this is the case, then you're going to need draw, but the problem is you don't really want to draw treasures, you want to be drawing action cards, and Adventurer very specifically does not draw action cards, right? It only draws 2 cards like Moat, which is a 2-cost card, but it doesn't even draw the cards that you want, right? Like you want to be drawing the actions. So it's Moat, but worse, and it costs 3 times as much, right? In sort of engine decks, like, ooh, wow, just absolutely terrible. Now, once you've removed your coppers, the next thing is that you're going to need some good targets for Adventurer, right? So you're going to need the strong cards for Adventurer to find. And now, in a lot of boards, what's the strongest treasure in the board? Well, it's gold, right? It costs 6 to buy a gold. Hey, that's the same cost as Adventurer, right? So early on, you're going to need to be buying golds because your Adventurer's not going to do very much for you without them. But then the problem is that by the time you decide, okay, I've got enough golds, now it's time to start adding Adventurer to your deck, it's probably too late. Like at this point, you've almost certainly found a better use for your plus actions, or it might just be that it's getting towards the end of the game at this point, right? Like how many 6-cost action cards are you going to be adding to your deck? So very, very hard to justify Adventurer in that case. Direct competition with gold. So its main issues, just to reiterate, directly competes with gold, which is a card that it kind of needs to start being useful. Yeah, sometimes you get other ones as well. It anti-synergizes with other action cards and therefore engines, which are usually the better strategy to go for. It just skips past all your action cards, which is not what you want. You want to be drawing those instead. So it's far too expensive for what you get with these serious issues. Probably get away with costing 4 even, right? Like for sure it shouldn't cost 6. But, it's not even very good at 5 is the reality because it's just not doing the things that you want. So as you can see, it's just extremely overpriced, right? Instead of costing 6, it could get away with costing 4. Like, that's wild pricing mishap. Okay, but not every card is useless, right? Surely every card out there has some sort of use. And yeah, it's true, sometimes you actually would buy Adventurer. It's pretty rare, but you actually will. So what sort of cases might we buy Adventurer? Well, you're going to need a deck, first of all, where you've removed your coppers, but then you find it hard to draw the treasures otherwise. So this probably means there's a load of junk, like curses or ruins hiding in there. So it might be that you got like a cursing attack, and also Moneylender is the only trashing. So you're going to get Moneylender to spike up to like your witch cards or whatever, and so you're not going to have any coppers, but you're throwing all of these curses into each other's decks, and you can't get rid of the curses then. And the next thing is that you're going to need to actually get the good treasures. Ideally, you'd have like golds instead of silvers, but it could be something like, Soothsayer is actually the only cursing attack out there. So each time you play Soothsayer, you throw a curse at your opponent, and you yourself get a gold. Well, this will be nice for Adventurer because, you've got that no coppers, high density of junk. You've also just happened while doing that to get a bunch of golds. Well, now if you want to draw those golds, Adventurer can do that. You're going to hit 6 with those golds in your deck, and you can start buying the Adventurer. And, well, I guess you still prioritise the Soothsayer, but over time you're going to not want to play the Soothsayer anymore. And, well, hey, you finally got some Adventurers, and they're there for you now. Tunnel is a nice synergy that existed, but bear in mind when I say nice synergy, all of the things still need to be present for Adventurer, right? No engine and copper trashing. Just Tunnel, Adventurer on its own is not good at all. I just need to remind that. But, Tunnel is nice in that it's getting you the golds that you want, and also, Adventurer might be discarding a lot of cards, which is good for Tunnel. It's important to note that if you're thinking about slog decks, like, for example, simple Duchy Duke thing going on, these usually benefit a lot more by actually keeping the coppers around, so Adventure is actually bad for those decks. The problem is with decks that are just like constantly trying to throw a lot of victory cards into them over time, is that the coppers are actually nice as padding, so that you don't just constantly draw the victory cards over and over again. If you like chapel down and then go for like just endless duchies and dukes, like, your turns are doing nothing because they're just going to be slammed full of useless green cards. So even in that sort of deck where you're thinking, oh, I want to push past all these victory cards, it's not actually good for Adventurer. So as you can see, Adventurer is extremely niche. It really needs a lot of things to be going in its favour in order to be good, and very occasionally those will happen, but overall, Adventurer is very bad, and it's just like way, way worse than a normal draw card, right? Like, Smithy is better than Adventurer, right? Let's be honest here. So that's it for those 6 cards. Hopefully that shows you that basically the cards were bad, and they weren't like unplayably bad for the most part. Well, maybe Adventurer a bit, and I guess Chancellor a bit as well. But, they could have been a lot better. They were just, the game was worse at designing cards early on in its life, and it got better at doing it. And so I was very happy with the second edition change to the base game. So nice that these cards aren't there for new players, and I can just throw a random, second edition base game at new players, and it'll be good. Basically, all the cards will actually be a lot more useful, and it doesn't matter what they build, they're going to be doing something, instead of these awful trap cards that, and in case of like Chancellor, it confused them, right? And then they'd all be buying like spies, and the game would go on forever, or they'd all just be like spinning their wheels with Thief, and then there's that time someone went bankrupt, just like, just bad experiences all around. So glad these cards are gone. Anyway, I hope that was interesting for you. Join me again next time, whenever that is, and we'll do a similar thing for the Intrigue cards as well. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.